Renting in England has just changed forever. The Renters' Rights Act has officially been signed into English law by the King. And everybody's asking, what is now going to happen to landlords? With all of these new laws that are being passed by the government whilst Labour are in power, where does that leave property investors? Now, this is a very important video because a lot of the changes that have now come into law are going to catch out a lot of landlords, but also a lot of renters. We've got things like no more bidding wars, no more no-fault evictions, limits on how much you can hike up rents, and a bunch more. So let's break it down and explain exactly what you need to do about it. So the first big thing that's happened is Section 21, no-fault evictions, have been completely abolished. What this means is that landlords can no longer evict tenants out of their house without a valid reason. Now, personally, and I've said this for a long time, I've never had to evict somebody without a reason anyway. So the landlords that are really upset that they can no longer evict a tenant for no reason, to me as a businessman, that doesn't really make any sense. So I'm quite comfortable with no-fault evictions. And also, as a tenant myself, because I am a tenant, I rent a property in Dubai. Yes, I own houses and homes as well, but I know exactly what it's like to be a tenant, and it's pretty horrible having a landlord that could just say, I want you to move out and not give you a reason. So tenants need to be protected, and I think that's just fair. Now, it's important to note that whilst this law has been passed, not all of these changes are immediate. They're going to be phased in, mostly starting from the 1st of May 2026, next year. Next, there are no more fixed term contracts. So if you move a tenant in, ordinarily, you will sign them on a 6-month or a 12-month AST contract. But as from May the 1st, that won't be the case. It will just be a monthly rolling contract. So they'll move in, and then if they want, they could just say, actually, here's my 2 months notice, and move out. Now, from a tenant's perspective, I totally get why this is a good thing, because I have had it, and I've seen my family members that have had it, where they sign a 12-month contract, and then they have a change of circumstances after a couple of months, something major happens. It's very rare, though. I mean, moving house is a big deal. You, generally speaking, have to get removal vans, you have to set up the utilities in your name. So you're not going to move into a house and go through all that trouble, all that hassle, pay your deposits, furnish the property, and then 2 months later say, actually, I want to move out. So I don't think this is going to be a game changer either way. It gives the tenants a little bit more flexibility. Where it will help tenants is if you sign a 12-month contract and then at the end of the 12 months, they automatically put you into a new 12-month contract. And now you're signing year by year. That's not very flexible from a tenant's perspective. So I don't think this is a bad thing. People that want complete flexibility will continue sticking with short-term lets like Airbnb and Booking.com. Generally speaking, if you move into a property and you set the utilities up, then you're probably going to be thinking pretty long-term. So if you can't get rid of a tenant with a Section 21 anymore, which is a no-fault eviction, how do you get rid of a tenant? And also, under what grounds? Well, this is the huge new laws they've added. All evictions will now be done under a Section 8. Let me explain what that is, and let me explain the reasons that you can legally evict a tenant now. So how does a Section 8 work? Well, there's two types of Section 8s. There's mandatory Section 8, and there's a discretionary Section 8. The mandatory Section 8s are things like they're not paying their rent. If they're not paying their rent, you serve them with a Section 8. Mandatory Section 8 would be that they're causing antisocial behaviour or doing anything criminal in the property. Section 8, get them out. Number 3, mandatory, is if the landlord wants to move back into the property. So if you're renting out a property but then you want to move into it, you can serve them on a Section 8 as long as you give them 4 months notice, which is fair, and as long as it's not within their first 12 months of moving into the property. And the fourth type of Section 8, which is under mandatory Section 8, would be if you want to move one of your close family members into the property. And you will have to evidence this as well. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of landlords that will want to remove a tenant for whatever reason, maybe because they think they could get higher rent elsewhere, but they can't do that anymore. So instead what they do is they say, I'm moving my mom in, and then they move their mom in for a week just to find a loophole. I would not advise that, but I'm sure that that will happen. The second category of a Section 8 would be discretionary grounds. So this will be things like if you've got a tenant, it's not that they're not paying rent or they're refusing to pay rent or they're 2, 3, 4 months in arrears. They're just constantly late. So if a tenant is continually late on paying their rent, you could, under discretionary grounds, depending on how consistent the late payments are, you could serve a Section 8 for that reason. Another type of discretionary Section 8 would be if the tenant is breaking the rules by, for example, subletting the property, or if they're smoking in the property. That would be a discretionary Section 8. Also, if they damage or neglect the property, if they're getting lots of complaints from the neighbours for things like noise, harassment. And finally, which is a really good one, is what tenants used to do was you'd serve them a Section 8, and then just before it went to court, they would then top up the rent. So now they're not behind anymore. So you have to cancel the court case, and then they'd get behind again, and they'd keep doing this. It'll be what we call repeated arrears cycles. They can't do this anymore. If they do this, and you've got evidence that they've done it, you can serve them a Section 8 under the discretionary grounds. So to summarize evictions, how does it work? Well, if you want to evict a tenant just because, you can't anymore. If you want to evict a tenant because you just think that you could potentially rent it out for a higher amount, you can't. You can't do that anymore. If you want to evict somebody now, what happens? Well, you need a reason. That reason could be they're being a bad tenant by either not paying, damaging the property, neglect, abuse, harassment, any of those reasons. And once you serve the Section 8 eviction on them, you then wait for the notice period, which will depending on what the grounds were. If it's something that if they're doing serious antisocial behaviour, the Section 8 notice period can be as short as 0 days. But typically, if it's continual late payments or if they're in arrears, it might be 4 weeks. So you then wait the notice period, and if they've still not left after the notice period is finished, you then put in a court application, which hopefully we pray that the courts won't be too backlogged. That is my slight concern, because the courts are pretty backlogged. You put your court application in, and there's a hearing. It goes to court. The judge looks at it, and assuming that you served the eviction properly and you followed the rules and you can evidence that, then what happens is the judge will tell the tenant they have to leave. And if they still don't leave, you will then get a permit for a bailiff to physically remove the tenant. There's no shortcuts. You can't rock up with a chainsaw or a baseball bat as a landlord. You can't evict a tenant for no reason. You have to follow the law. This is infuriating as a landlord when you're having to wait for the courts and cases are adjourned and it takes months and months. It is an absolute joke, and the government need to get their act together and get better processes around the courts and stop the ridiculous backlogs. However, it is what it is. And I mean, a lot of my properties, I don't have tenants, I have guests. That is a completely different set of rules for a different video, but for tenants, these are the rules. Now, putting my strategic hat on and looking at how this is going to change the scope of landlords, of buy-to-let across the UK, here's what I think is going to happen. Firstly, and this is a shame on tenants, the fact that you can't evict a tenant without a legitimate reason, and potentially if the tenant won't leave even with a Section 8, you have to go to court, and courts are backlogged. What's going to happen is landlords are going to become even more pedantic and picky about who they move into their property. Because let's be real, I've got a lot of properties, and not just in London, in places up north, in places that aren't particularly popping. When you've got a decent house, you will get dozens of applications for your property. I've just rented out a property in the Midlands in a place called Bloxwich, which is just a working class little town outside Warsaw. Nice little house, rent £1,000. My mortgage payment's about £250 a month. Nice little buy-to-let. Guess what? When it went up, I was getting loads of applications from the letting agency. I have the choice of who I choose. So what's going to happen, I think, is the tenants that might have slightly bad credit because they forgot to cancel their T-Mobile bill, those people are going to find it very difficult to rent. That's my prediction. I don't think that's good. I think that's sad. I understand that the Renters' Right Act was meant to protect tenants, but I also think it will make it very difficult to rent. I think it's also going to increase rents. I think it's going to push rents up. But here's the biggest change, and this is to the landlord's advantage. If you're a bad landlord and you operate illegally, you don't have a license, you do something wrong as a landlord, you are named and shamed. right? You're blacklisted. If you don't pay for your HMO license, for example, the councils come down on you. You'll be on the list of somebody that didn't pay. That's going to be even more the case. In fact, now what's going to happen is every landlord will need to be registered and on a database with the property redress scheme. So landlords are held in check. We have regulations. We have to follow the law. Otherwise, we'll be exposed. We'll be on a database. That's how it's always worked. I'm proud to say I've never been on any of the bad boy databases because I am, in fact, a good landlord. However, tenants, I've been saying, why aren't tenants named and shamed? I've actually, if I've got a bad tenant who's literally playing the system, being an absolute pain in the neck, and then what? And then they leave and go and do it to someone else. How does that happen? That happens because of Section 21. Because historically, it's always been easier to get rid of a tenant with Section 21. You don't want to go to court. You don't want to serve a Section 8. So if a tenant's not paying their rent, even if you do a Section 8, what a lot of landlords do is they'll do a Section 8, but then they'll run a Section 21 alongside the Section 8. So if the courts are taking a little while, or you've got a Section 21 running along as well, which is no fault eviction and fault eviction at the same time. What happens is then the tenant leaves because they have to, but it doesn't actually go on their record. As far as that tenant's concerned, they got off scot-free and they can do it to somebody else. That's going to change. That will change. Now, Section 8 being the only way you can evict a tenant, bad tenants are going to be much more exposed and it's going to be on their record. And they can't have a fresh start anymore. And this could even happen if you're not a malicious tenant, if you just can't pay your rent and then you get a Section 8 and you end up having to get kicked out and you're evicted. Now it's on your record forever. That's a little bit scary. And it means that landlords are going to be able to check the tenants that they're moving in. So is this a good thing or a bad thing? I think it's nuanced and we will have to see. But as a landlord and an investor and an entrepreneur myself, you've always got to adapt and you've got to make it good. It's not about how are the rules, it's about learning the rules and then playing the game to win, but also to provide a good service and good accommodation to your tenants. That's what you want. They're customers. In fact, there's a new thing now which is about rent reviews. So you can't now just hike up the rents. You can't just say, oh, you were paying $2,000, but now you need to pay $3,000. You can't do that anymore. You can do an annual rent review, but then if you are putting the rent up, it has to be fairly done according to the going rates of the market, and you have to give 2 months notice before a rent rise. You know what I think about that? I think that's fair. I think if you've got a tenant who's paying their rent, keeping their head down, why would you hike the rent up? In fact, I have a philosophy, me and my wife Amanda, we very, very rarely raise the rents. If we've got a good tenant, and it's actually really good because what can happen is if you've got someone paying £1,000 a month, but they've been in there 10 years, and then after 10 years, they're still paying £1,000 a month. Not only are they the best tenant ever and really happy and talk good about you on social media, but also when they finally do move out, rather than you thinking, oh, my tenant's moved out, that's going to cost me to find a new one, we're like, yes, they've moved out, £2,000 rent. So I'm not saying it's bad to put the rents up, but I do think that having some policy around how much you can do it by, and it has to be fair. I'm all for fair business. Some other very interesting changes, which won't affect most fair, ethical landlords anyway, but do open opportunities if you're trying to do things like rent to rent. So now landlords can't demand 6 months rent up front. So if you're renting out, you can't say, I want 6 months rent, which a lot of landlords do at the moment. They can't engineer bidding wars. So if they advertise the property at £2,000, they can't say highest offer and engineer a bidding war. They have to rent it for the price that it's advertised at. And these rules, whilst I think personally, I understand why they're doing it to help tenants and to stop rents getting out of control, which is fine. But these rules, I think, slightly distort the market. And it's going to bring so many opportunists that are going to be able to, because whilst the landlord can't demand 6 months rent up front, you can still offer it and he can still say yes. So you could say to the landlord, listen, I want to rent it on a company let and I want to give you 6 months rent up front, and the landlord can say yes. Another huge opportunity is rent to rents, because whilst the Renters' Right Act, in my opinion, is not really that bad, because landlords don't understand it, They are freaked out. All these new laws have changed. Think of what I've just said in this video, all these different changes. A lot of landlords, they've only got 1 or 2 properties. They haven't got time to figure out all the new laws. And so these landlords are now thinking, oh, I don't want tenants anymore. Oh my gosh, Section 21's banned. So these landlords are perfect candidates for saying, listen, if you don't want tenants, but you still want to get rent, how about this? How about I'll rent the property on a company let? And then what I'll do is I'll then run the property as a serviced accommodation property. There's no tenants. We have me, a company let, outside of the act, meaning that everything I've talked about in this video doesn't apply anymore because you don't have to serve me a Section 8. You don't have to, it's a company let, it's a different set of rules. It's much more in favor of the landlord, but also you then rent it to guests on serviced accommodation and make a nice profit. That is going to be huge. It is going to be easier than ever to get into the rent-to-rent business because more and more landlords and commercial and residential agents are going to start opening up to it more now. So I'm quite excited because serviced accommodation is huge. It's popping. Rent-to-rent is a great strategy. The hardest part of rent-to-rent has always been getting landlords and agents to say yes. So I think there's a huge opportunity there. But I also think as a buy-to-let landlord, I think that the rules are fair. They are clear. And if you can just get your head around them a little bit, maybe watch this video once or twice, interest rates have dropped. At the time of recording this video, interest rates are now just 3.75%. So I think buy-to-let is becoming a viable business model, certainly in the Midlands and in the northern parts of the country. There are other huge opportunities like purchase lease option agreements, where you can buy properties with just £1 deposits. And landlords are open to this because they're wanting to just get rid of their properties. Maybe they can't, they're in negative equity. I think the landscape is huge if you know what you're doing and if you can structure a strategy around where you're at. Use your skills, your strategy. I think it can be huge. So I decided, with all these changes, I decided to put on a free, completely free online training where I go into detail about all the different strategies and the opportunities in the market at the moment where you can potentially maximize these opportunities in the property industry right now. So if you'd like to join me and learn further and see what's possible to do, even if you're starting with very little money, or if you're a landlord wanting to just maximize and scale your portfolio, I'd like to invite you to join me completely for free. I'll leave a link in the description and it's going to be taking over like Zoom. It's going to be an online webinar. It's going to be good. I don't think you're going to leave disappointed because I'm going to be giving away all of my secrets that I'm personally doing and how I've made millions of pounds over the years and done it tax efficiently too. So click the link below and I'll see you on the free online training.